Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit off the cuff about um, finding the sweet spot for practice. This was kind of on my mind because somebody on Reddit was talking about being exhausted after 30 minutes of practice, and yeah, that's gonna happen. um, it's gonna happen, especially if you're working on things that are extremely mentally exhausting. And what that tends to look like for me is like I notice it very noticeably when I get a large stack of new music for some gigs, and I'm learning a lot of new music. So all that novel stimulus that's pushing me to do things, some of which might be really hard for me, it's exhausting. Sight reading is also one of those things that if you're reading difficult music, um, especially slightly above the level that would be good for you to practice sight reading, you're going to be very mentally exhausted. So the problem is that people also go really far to the other side. When I hear people talk about how they're practicing 4 and 5 and 6 hours a day, especially like music majors, um, I think they're just getting in a lot of absolutely garbage practice. Because you can practice that long when you're playing, but you're not really doing anything that is challenging your brain mentally. Like, I can play all day long. If it's like music I know, I can play forever, right? And I mean, I have to sometimes when they're like gigs that I'm doing. If I'm doing a musical and we have two showings that day, I can do those two showings and I'm not exhausted from playing the music. I'm almost more exhausted from just almost the mental boredom. Um, because at that point I'm prepared and the music's not hard. So that's the other thing. Once you have learned some music, it's not nearly as hard. It's not as mentally challenging. So any new music I get that might be mentally challenging on the first day, I can practice for a lot longer the second day without getting as exhausted. I have processed some of the basic ideas and now I'm just working out, some technical hurdles and this, that, and the other. Um, but some people will practice, there's scales every day. I've talked about this so much, but like things like scales where you go on this sort of autopilot and you play all of these technical exercises that aren't you're not even really checked in, or they're playing music that they already know, especially when people over ambitiously are trying to play really hard music. And unfortunately, this is actually the way that a lot of colleges design their programs. You've got three big pieces of repertoire a semester. It is mentally just absolutely defeating for like the first couple of days when you're learning, but then you get into that little loop of just playing by pure muscle memory. And yeah, you can do that with almost no mental effort. And that no mental effort is a really big red flag that you're not actually processing anything. And that's a huge part of what makes people just fall apart during performances. They're relying so much on that long series of procedural memories that they've tied together with their hands, and they're not actually able to process what they're playing. Um, I always compare this to memorizing a poem in a foreign language. You can get it to where your mouth parts are moving through all of the syllables and all of the phonemes that you need, and you might even be thinking of what those things sound like and blah 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 whatever, but you're not thinking the words the way that you would in English. If you were saying something in English, you are in control. Like, you're actually in control of the thoughts, if that makes sense. Like, if I want to tell a story about, I don't know, a dog chasing a frisbee past a tree, I actually know what that looks like in my head. I know what I'm talking about. So I could actually go into detail and I understand what I'm talking about. But if you're reciting a poem in a foreign language, you don't really know what you're talking about. You're working really fucking hard to just, what is the next phoneme? What's the next syllable? What are these sounds that I'm trying to make? And a lot of people are playing piano that way. They don't know what the parts are. They don't know what the words are. They haven't understood the language of music, so they're not really using the language of music. They're just regurgitating. And that's hard. That actually takes up a lot of mental bandwidth that could be spent better on like musical phrasing and things like that. Um, I've kind of veered off as I tend to do. But yeah, there's this sweet spot. Let's get back to that. Really, really difficult stuff is really challenging early on, and then On the flip side, just doing things on repeat forever is something you can just practice for hours, but you're not actually getting anything out of it. You're not processing it. I guess that was kind of the point I was getting to, is you're not actually processing the language. You're not learning vocabulary and how to use that vocabulary. And so when people are learning really hard literature, but they don't actually have the knowledge of the language, and they're not learning language, they're not learning theory, they're not really processing what notes am I playing, what phrases, am I making from these chord progressions or whatever, they're not getting a lot out of that. It's just pure repetition, and that's easy. It's easier. And I think a lot of people fall into that trap of, okay, so our brains actually are, they fall into this trap because our brains literally seek the path of least resistance. They try to work less hard. It is one of the most energy consuming things our brains are when they're processing information. It is very energy intensive for our bodies to do that. And so it actively tries to not think too hard, and it tries to find these ways to justify, oh yeah, I'm still getting something out of this pure rote repetition. And it's always easier to do that. It's also why people like to work on like one song at a time, and they just want to pour everything into it, because practicing like the way that I would recommend, where you're learning a couple of songs at once, maybe like 5 or 10, and you're not spending more than like 5 or 10 minutes on any one section, you're constantly moving along. That is hard. It's really hard because you're constantly introducing slightly novel stimulus. You're forcing yourself to read the new thing. You can't sit there, buffer in what you're currently playing, and then just put it on repeat for an hour. It is harder to practice this other way, and you will practice less hours, but you'll get a lot more out of it. But you don't feel like it. Your brain convinces you otherwise. So there's just an issue of finding this balance, the sweet spot for practice, so that you are effectively working on the things that need work. You're not overreaching. If you're learning some new music and you find yourself, pretty exhausted, yeah, that's going to happen. I would say that you probably shouldn't be just like absolutely brutally exhausted after 30 minutes. You should feel a little tired. You really just should not feel defeated. Now, I would say take a break after 30 minutes. Like, everybody should be trying to take breaks after 30 minutes. I really try to put 30 minutes as the upper limit for a given practice session for myself. Granted, I have the advantage of the fact that I don't have to consolidate all of my practice into one tiny section of the day, because I do this professionally. And so I intentionally can spread it out throughout the day. It's kind of my day job to practice, and so I spread it out intentionally, and that's lots of little 30-minute sections here and there with plenty of breaks. So you need to take breaks. But I would say that you should not be absolutely exhausted after 30 minutes. It's probably a sign that what you're working on is too hard. It's pushing your mental bandwidth farther than it needs to be. Your mental bandwidth, the idea that you can only really pay attention to like any one thing at a time, right? If you're trying to deal with too many difficult things simultaneously, it takes a lot more brain power to deal with those. So like if you've got, I'm dealing with this rhythm is hard for me, and there's a chord shape that I'm not very comfortable with, and there's a large right hand or left hand leap that I'm not comfortable with, you're trying to process too many things at one time that are all too difficult. And none of those are just kind of automatic for you. And not automatic in the, like, I don't have to think about it, but automatic in the telling a story about a dog chasing a frisbee past a tree thing. You can tell that story, and you are in control of your language. And so that should be a thing where you go, I've got these leaps. Okay, I know how to do those. No problem. Here's that rhythm, and I just know how that goes. And, here's this chord shape, whatever. I know how that is. You're not trying to remember what your hands do. You just know what your hands do. If you're talking about that dog, how much are you thinking about, okay, to make the sound duh, I have to put my tongue in a certain place and I have to push this certain amount of air. You have all the technique, right? You know how to speak. You have all the technique to speak. And so you don't have to think about it so hard. That's kind of where you want to be with piano ultimately, but that takes doing lots of isolated technical practice separately, which also is one of those things. It's more efficient to practice that sort of technical stuff. You're practicing your language and your vocabulary and how to say those words separately. It's kind of like when you were learning to write early on, you would do that. You're just writing like a handful of letters over and over type stuff. Or when you were learning to type, you're just typing sentences with ASDF and JKL semicolon, right? You're just practicing with this tiny amount of vocabulary, and you're just practicing those things over and over until those are very easy, and then you add vocabulary. So you do need to do that. But know that there's just going to be a balance between things that are exhausting and things that aren't. And you shouldn't be surprised if you're exhausted. You just need to understand the mechanisms that get you to be exhausted. You just have to learn to self-assess, is this because this is just way too far beyond my level? Like if you were just absolutely defeated after 30 minutes, you might want to rethink whatever piece you're working on, because that piece might just be beyond you, or you're trying to take too large of a chunk of that piece to learn at a time. Now, my rule of thumb for finding the sweet spot is always you should be able to sight read something at about half tempo. That should put you in the sweet spot. And if you can't sight read anything, then you need to remediate your sight reading. And people really hate that because they want to work on really hard, really impressive sounding, cool music, and they don't want to put in the investment early on to get to that point. And it sucks. And the real challenge is that the further on you get into playing piano, the worse it gets. This is why I really encourage people to get into reading really early in the process when they're learning, because when you're learning new stuff on piano, everything's fucking amazing, right? Like every tiny little thing that you achieve feels revelatory. But if you're a person who like spent 3 years brute forcing a whole bunch of cool literature and you feel like you're playing a really awesome repertoire, and you have played things that sound really awesome, now it's not as revelatory when you go back and you successfully can put together things out of the Alfred book. That doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like success. It feels like you've taken this giant step back, and it hurts your ego. So you really should be putting that you should be investing in those things like reading very early in the process. And unfortunately, if you're past that point, you just need to go back and remediate those problems, and that sucks. And so let's talk about sight reading. Sight reading is also one of those things where you just should not feel that mentally defeated by your sight reading. It's tiring. Something like sight reading, most of the musicianship skills, sight reading, improvisation, playing by ear, those are very cognitively demanding tasks. And it's the same idea as everything else. You need to start with a small vocabulary and get very comfortable with that vocabulary and then add vocabulary. I wasted so many years working on my sight reading, because I was out of college and I was starting piano as sort of a secondary instrument, but I had a degree in music, right? I had played really awesome stuff on trumpet. I was a very good sight reader on trumpet, and so I kept sight reading where I thought I should be on piano. I was trying to sight read near the level of the stuff that I was playing as prepared music on piano, and that was a waste of time. I was not internalizing any of the vocabulary. I was not figuring out how to self-assess and be like, okay, here are these technical aspects that I have command over, and now I'm applying them. Like, my mental bandwidth was completely overrun. Like, I was out. I was way past my limit, and so I wasn't really digesting almost anything. I wasn't spending enough time repeating simple vocabulary to get very, very comfortable with that simple vocabulary. And so eventually I figured it out, and that was just literally like one of the most life-changing things for me, like pedagogically and for my career and everything else, right? Like, it was a huge deal, and it's why I'm so passionate to talk about this specific issue, because it is such a big problem for people. They're always trying to sight read way too close to their level, and even when they try to sight read lower, easier stuff below their level, they're still overshooting how easy it should be. It needs to be offensively easy. It needs to be just ridiculous. It's why I really like, even if you've been playing for 10 years, if you're that person who can't sight read well, yeah, you need to be working on something like the Hannah Smith, where you literally just have 5 finger patterns for 500 plus exercises. Like, if you can't do that, you don't need to add more vocabulary. You need to be comfortable with that vocabulary first. I don't care that you played the Waldstein or whatever else you think you've played that you thought you did a great job on, and so you shouldn't be lower to this. You need to work on that. And the thing about that is that sight reading is a volume game. I always talk about that, like, sight reading is just absolute volume. You need a huge volume of sight reading. That's how you get good at it. That's how you got good at your native language. It's how you get good at any secondary languages. You spend a lot of time consuming a very large amount of material in that language, and most of it is low-level vocabulary. I like watching some interesting linguistics channels on YouTube, and some of these speech people will talk about how, like, really, like, most languages, yeah, you want to be ultra fluent. You're talking vocabularies and thousands of words, but, like, you can be competent at a language with vocabularies in like 400 to 600 range, right? You don't need to know that many words to be pretty competent speaking that language. And so, it's kind of that same thing. Like, people are trying to do this really outlandish stuff when they're sight reading, but, like, no, you just need to get good at this small amount of vocabulary, and you need to read a lot in that, because when you learn one of these secondary languages, most of how you're going to use that language is simple words. Even when you learn your native language, most of the reinforcement is like you reading stop signs and signs of stores and like little things in the newspaper, which aren't going out of their way to be like perspicaciously loquacious. Like, they're not using ridiculous words. Most of the vocabulary is aimed at a general audience, and so everybody gets very good at this smaller amount of vocabulary. And yes, you can get more sophisticated and add onto your vocabulary, but that vocabulary doesn't stick unless you use it. So if you're trying to add words to your vocabulary, you have to use them. But anyway, my point was, like, with sight reading, it's a volume game, and you cannot consume a huge amount of volume if you are just mentally defeated. So you need to be spending most of your time sight reading on easy enough material that you are not completely mentally defeated. You need to be in that realm where you can keep your brain ahead of your fingers and you know what you're doing, you're in control, you're telling that story about that dog, and, like, you know what's happening, and you're able to read ahead, and you're not just mentally dead by the end. Yes, you can push yourself a little bit, but you're just not going to get that much out of doing that. And it's the same thing with music that you're learning. You're not going to get as much out of pushing to really, really difficult material. The way that you get good at learning new and more difficult material more quickly is that you've added to that vocabulary a little bit at a time. You have gotten mastery, technical mastery over some rhythm pattern or some whatever technical chord shapes or arpeggios or whatever, and now that thing is mostly just using those bits of vocabulary. It's the same way that you can just easily pick up most books and just read them, because you have that vocabulary already. You're not struggling through it. Most books are just written to where you can just, nonfiction books are written where fiction books are written where you can just sit down and read, and you know most of the words, and you're not having to work at it, right? Unless you're reading something considerably dense, So that's kind of where you want to live, is in this little middle space, this sweet spot for learning, for learning new material that you're actually preparing, especially for sight reading. I didn't go into it in too much detail because it's kind of complicated, but, like, same thing for improvisation and playing by ear, which are really, really intermixed strongly. But that's a thing where you need to start with a tiny vocabulary, get very comfortable with that vocabulary, and then add to the vocabulary. All of this is just language. It really is just language. I watched... I actually wanted to make a whole video about this, but I watched this Nari Soul short where she was playing with this accordion player. Some of you may have run into this. But she was playing some Chopin thing, and he was trying to make a point that this piece could be played. It could be jazz, right? Just this little line, and it's mostly about just putting these accents in this specific spot, or just kind of putting them in the right spots. And so he tried to have her do it, and of course she's not quite as adept. She's not able to audiate what he's hearing. And man, but as soon as she was playing it straight, like, I knew exactly what he was going for. He was going for this very specific bebop. Right? You could hear it even when she was playing it straight, but that's just because I have that experience to be able to audiate that a little bit, right? So, like, she didn't quite do it, but then he did it, and he just kind of did it pretty much by ear. Now, I'm sure the guy, before they had this conversation, had looked at this to some degree, but she made the comment that she's like, man, you just did that, but I've been practicing that for weeks. And this really, Nari Soul's a better pianist than I am by a long shot, and I'm super impressed with how much she has branched out since she started her channel. I remember really early on in her channel, her having a lot of like language problems with talking about theory, because common practice period theory, classical theory, is very different than how we use contemporary theory, and the older theory does not have the language to describe some of the things that are in modern contemporary theory. So that's a whole other thing that I have a problem with. But no, she's grown a lot, but she still came from that very classical background where you just sit there and you work on this one piece, and you're not thinking about all of your music in terms of, oh, these are just pieces of vocabulary that I'm putting together to make words, to make sentences, to make paragraphs, to write a story. And the thing with that accordion guy who just ripped out that awesome version of that Chopin and turned it into a hot bebop line on the spot and didn't need weeks to prepare is because that's just language to him. What he's hearing is specific bebop lines, bebop scale portions that are outlining specific chords. Like, he gets the vocabulary part of it. He hears a chord progression, and he knows the bebop lines that specifically outline the threes and the sevens, and uses the sharp five, and stuff I can't go into super great detail about, but like, you understand, if you get the language, then you can just say it. You can just do the thing. And so he's coming from a place, and jazz people and a lot of pop people are coming from a place where they have a lot of vocabulary that they've learned. They've decided to learn the language in its entirety. They are not trying to recite foreign language poems without understanding the language. He gets the language, and so he can hear that, and he can repeat that back. If somebody told you a specific story about the dog and the frisbee, you could tell it back very quickly. Now, if somebody did that in a foreign language, you couldn't, right? You don't understand that they're talking about dogs and frisbees and trees because you don't know the words for dog and frisbee and tree in their language. And so to you, that is just a weird collection of unrelated phonemes, and it's so much harder. And if you needed to learn that story about the dog and the tree and the frisbee to relate it to somebody, how long would it take you? It would take you weeks to sit there and remember those unrelated phonemes. But if you understand the language, bam, you can just snap it out and just go. You could retell that story that you heard. Hey man, this guy told me this story about this dog chasing this frisbee past this tree. Let me give you the details. You could do that almost instantaneously after hearing it because you understand the language. So that's that is not even the whole point of this video, but it is just the center of the entire ethos of how I think about music and music pedagogy, and really people just need to be thinking in terms of music being a language. Almost every aspect of how you approach music works better if you think about it in terms of learning a language, and then you look into how do I effectively learn a language, especially like a secondary language. But even if you have good critical thinking skills, you can think back to maybe how you learned language. You had to learn your alphabet, and then you eventually learned these tiny words, little 3-letter words and stuff, and then you started putting them together into these tiny sentences, see Jane run type sentences, and then you just added vocabulary. and you reinforced it every day by reading little bits of stuff in class and constantly just reading things in the world. And it still took years. And it took years at the time of your life when you were the most neuroplastic, right? You're just an absolute sponge when you're really young. So you can't expect that learning to sight read on piano is going to be faster, because the other aspect of this is that, I alluded to this earlier. Technique is a foreign thing for us when we're playing an instrument, but for language, it's not. Um, we we do with spoken language. We almost all learn from a sound before sight model. That means we are speaking the language before we recognize how to like use symbols, words on a page, right? We know how to say these words. And the big part of that is that we know how to make the phonemes. We know how to make all of this mechanism work. It's so complicated and we don't think about it. It's just sort of natural for us. Your lips have to do certain things, your tongue has to do things, your jaw has to do things. You have to push a specific amount of air past your larynx, and you have to activate vocal cords in a very specific way. Have you ever really just tried to like reverse engineer and think about how incredibly complicated it is just to make specific sounds? But you can just do it on command. You know what sound you want to make, you know how to say a word, and you just say it. You don't have to think about the technique. But with an instrument, you have to think about the technique. And that's why you have to spend all this time in isolated technical practice on scales and arpeggios and all the other stuff, and chords and inversions and different rhythmic composites. Those are not just inherent to you. So you have the extra layer that you're not coming in like you do with spoken language, where you're coming in already having the technique and you know how it sounds, and now you're just learning to read it. And so with an instrument, you have to learn that technique, and you probably don't have the sound before sight thing. You have a cultural collection of basic ideas about how things sound, but we tend to use a sight before sound model when we're learning music. We learn to read first, and we honestly just don't focus enough on ear. That's a whole other thing, and it's really complicated because it can work the other way, and it maybe should. The problem is once the genie's out of the once the cat's out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle, you are in a situation where it's really hard. You can't put it back in, right? You have trouble going back to learning the other way. So once you've just learned all the notes and reading them, it's hard to learn by ear after the fact. But just because of how abstract music is, it really helps that we have this, and how unnatural technical stuff is for music. It really helps to have this way to abstract it out, so that we can actually understand what we're talking about. The problem is that in the classical tradition, we just never go back to address the ear thing. I mean, the Suzuki method sort of does it the other way around. It's a sound before sight thing. That has its own downsides that I'm not going to go into great detail on. But yeah, there's just this issue of you need to address all of them. And now I'm completely off topic, but I'm just going to continue rambling a little bit about this. Yeah, you could be learning them all together, because I think I've talked about this before. There's a problem where people think you can learn to either play by ear or play, sight reading. And it's not true. It's just that once you learn one modality, every other modality is harder now. Not actually harder, but relatively harder, because you have a system to do a thing. And so this always happens that you give in to your stronger modality when you need to work on your weaker one. So let's say that you read music, not even necessarily sight read, but that you read music and you want to learn to play by ear. Now, you might have spent 4 or 5 years learning to read music, but then you get frustrated within a week if you're not able to play complex things by ear. And mostly that's because you're trying to learn too much vocabulary by ear. Once you're not starting with simple enough vocabulary, but you're also just not realizing, oh, it took me all this time to learn to read. And so what happens, you just give up and you say, oh, fuck it. Like, I obviously can just read better. Why am I wasting my time trying to play by ear? And you cave and you just go to music. And the flip happens too. People who learn to play by ear first have that problem where they're like, okay, I'm going to try to read sheet music, but they give themselves a week and they're like, well, this is bullshit. Like, I can play better by ear anyway. Why am I wasting my time with these stupid dots? And they give in. It's so hard to force yourself to learn from that early vocabulary stage a new modality. But if, like, pedagogically you married those things together early in the process, it's not as hard. But most teachers are not, because of the classical tradition and the shitty way that academia and music competitions and all of that are structured. We don't put, the teachers don't have the skills to actually put that together early in the process. They don't know how to give, I mean, most classical teachers literally could not improvise like a simple pentatonic, idea over a 2-chord progression. Like one of the simplest places that you could start. They could not do that because they never worked on that skill. And so how can they teach it? They can't, and so they don't. But you could to kids, like you could to, and not just kids, but beginners. You absolutely could be having improvisation be part of that. And honestly, if improvisation and ear was integrated with the reading stuff, then I'm pretty sure most of those students would make those connections a lot stronger, because you do have to, in a way, de-abstract those ideas. So, like, if you're trying to do this little improvisation, I don't have the I don't have the keyboard in the view, but let's say my piano is on, right? Okay, so if I just had this little 1-4 progression, right? If I was just doing something like that, and I just want to make a little melody. Right? Something real simple, right? Really, really basic. At some point, it makes it easier to de-abstract the 1 and the 4 chord that you're like, oh, I don't understand how these work. And, well, I'll do what the page says. But you're not thinking about how different notes sound against these chords, different scale degrees sound against these chords. And so when you have to not just do what the page says and you actually have to think about those things, it makes all of that theory make sense. And then when you go back and you're playing off of the page, you're like, oh, I get it. Like, I see this, and like, I understand why they wrote a C and an F over this chord, like in the Alfred book. And I understand what that means. And it's like, oh, and I also don't have to play exactly the voicing the way that it's written on the page. I could make this a little more interesting. And you can just do things and realize that you have that freedom. But yeah, anyway, it's a whole thing. It frustrates me that pedagogy is not better designed to integrate all of those things and be, I hate the word, but it's the accurate word, be more holistic. Holistic is one of those words that has been adopted by woo medical crap, pseudoscience, to mean a totally different thing. But holistic just means, in its entirety, more or less, right? But yes, a holistic approach to music where reading and ear and all of those things and improvisation and reading chords is all integrated. Like, there's no reason it shouldn't be, and it makes you better at all of the things. To the point I was making earlier, maybe Nari Soul wouldn't have spent weeks working on that specific passage if she had just learned the vocabulary, right? If she had been thinking in terms of vocabulary and she had gotten better at her brain chunking together those bits of vocabulary, if she had a wider vocabulary that also included lots of jazz and bebop ideas, and also just her brain was more centered around what's happening in functional theory terms rather than what's happening in hand-shaped terms, which I think in a lot of her older videos I definitely see that in the way that she would diagram how she practices. She'll be thinking melodic lines, but I don't think she's thinking nearly as much in terms of harmonic chunking. But if she had done that, then it's like, oh, then you just hear those ideas and you can, or just see them on the page and you go, hey, which is a lot of how sight reading works. You're seeing these chords on the page and you go, I know what that chord is. And you just, you're doing things from it, man. Like I'm literally, there's music in front of me because I was working on this musical, and it's like I'm looking at it just immediately. I'm like, oh well, that's just a D flat major chord in a weird like shape, you know. Um, so yeah, it's a whole thing. Anyway, the point of this was supposed to be about finding that sweet spot. So make sure that you find the sweet spot. Make sure that you are not practicing for hours mindlessly, but also make sure that you're not constantly overreaching such that you're exhausted. And don't trick yourself by getting exhausted on a really hard piece, but it's like, oh, I can totally handle this the next day, because you've already sort of buffered some of it and you've relied on procedural memory. And so it's less exhausting the second day. That doesn't mean that it is level appropriate for you. Um, so just constantly be self-assessing. Everything about practicing efficiently is self-assessing. Self-assessing the difficulty of the things you're working on, self-assessing what you're doing with things. When people run into like roadblocks with tempos on things like scales or arpeggios, it's usually because they are not doing self-assessment of the tiny motions that they're making. They don't go back and slow down and think about, oh, where is my thumb crossing and how do I, little tiny stuff. It all adds up. But most people are on autopilot and they're not actually processing because it's easier to not process. It's easier to go on autopilot. So anyway, this has been a journey. Hopefully any of that was helpful.